Thank you, Joseph. I'm very pleased to serve as the moderator for this session today. Excuse me. I'm a registered dietitian and certified diabetes care and education specialist and operate a consulting practice focused on nutrition and diabetes in Asheville, North Carolina. I've been involved in translating and communicating the science of low and no calorie sweeteners for more than 30 years. We have 3 15-minute presentations followed by 45 minutes for an exchange among our panelists and to take questions from you, our audience. On to our session and speakers. These are my disclosures. I've been a very long-time consultant on Heartland Splenda brand sweeteners and have more recently done some work for IFIT on their new series of LNCS fact sheets for healthcare providers. And yes, I will use the term LNCS for low and no calorie sweeteners often during our talk. Today's session aims to promote a dialogue to address concerns and questions about the presence of LNCS in the food supply, given the ongoing efforts to achieve the goal across much of the globe of reducing added sugars consumption. The panel will provide their insights on their topic of expertise, and each will speak, as I noted, for about 15 minutes, and then we'll come back to a nice long Q&A session. So please enter your questions at any time as the panelists are presenting. Let's kick off this session with Dr. Joanne Anyagwe. Joanne is a regulatory toxicologist with the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, we'll abbreviate as FDA for sure, in the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition and the Office of Food Additive Safety. Joanne has substantial experience in the safety evaluation and risk assessment of food ingredients and color additives. Joanne is also an adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Nutritional Sciences at Howard University, where she teaches graduate students nutritional biochemistry. To set the stage, Joanne will tell us about how the FDA evaluates the safety of LNCS. Joanne.
Thank you, Hope, for that very kind introduction. And I'm looking forward to sharing what I know about safety evaluation process for food ingredients, specifically for low and no calorie sweeteners. Next slide, please. So this is my disclaimer. The opinions and conclusions expressed in this presentation are solely my views and not necessarily the views of the Food and Drug Administration. Next slide, please. So the objective of this presentation is to share with you how food ingredients, including low and no calorie sweeteners, are regulated, provide you with the safety assessment process for food ingredients, and the key of this presentation is how much of this LNCS is safe to consume. Next slide, please. So like you heard already, I work for the Food and Drug Administration, and the mission of the FDA is to promote and protect public health by ensuring the safety of the nation's drugs food supply, including dietary supplements, medical devices, biologics, cosmetics, and tobacco products. Next slide, please. So I work in the Office of Food Additive Safety, which is within the Center for Food Safety and Nutrition. And the mission of OFAS is to protect and enhance consumer health by ensuring the safety of food ingredients and food contact materials. There are several programs within that office, but for the purpose of this presentation, the programs that we'll talk about will be the GRAS notification program and the food additive petition program. And there are several expertise within the office that would evaluate the safety of food ingredients: chemists, toxicologists, microbiologists, nutritionists, pharmacologists, and pathologists. Next slide, please. So OFAS regulates LNCS. They are also known as high-intensity sweeteners. So these are sugar substitutes or sugar alternatives because they are many times sweeter than sugar, but contribute very little or no calorie when added to food. However, they must be safe for consumption before they can be consumed or added to food. And LNCS are regulated through two pathways. You have the food additive petition process, which I'll refer to as FAP going forward. And we also have the GRAS ingredient, which is the GRN process. So what is GRAS? GRAS is generally recognized as safe. So this is just a listing of some food additives and GRAS substances that you'll find out there in foods in the United States. So some examples are Advantame, aspartame, neotame, sucralose for food additives. And you have the highly purified stevia glycosides and the monk fruit that you'll find for GRAS substances that are out there. Next slide, please. So what really is a food additive? So the Food Additive Amendment to the Federal Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act of 1958 defined what a food additive is. So a food additive is any substance, the intended use of which results or may reasonably be expected to result in it becoming a component or otherwise affecting the characteristic of any food, including any substance that's intended for use in producing, manufacturing, packing, processing, packaging, and transporting of food. So that's the definition of a food additive. And that's distinct from what we call generally recognized as safe. Next slide, please. Just keep clicking, Mary. So a GRAS substance is different from a food additive substance. A GRAS substance is generally recognized amongst experts qualified by scientific training and experience to evaluate its safety as adequately shown to be safe under the conditions of use. Next, please click, Mary, please click. Okay, so the difference with a GRAS substance is that a GRAS substance doesn't require pre-market approval. A food additive requires that the company, the sponsor, should submit the relevant safety information to the FDA, and that has to be reviewed and approved by the FDA before that food additive can go into the market. So a successful food additive petition results in a regulation. For a GRAS substance, you submit the information to the FDA, but it's a notification process. So you as the notifier owns your safety conclusion. For food additive, FDA owns that safety conclusion. FDA has an inventory of GRAS notices from 1998 and it's updated periodically. Next slide, please. So if you're trying to market a food ingredient, how would you know if your food ingredient should be marketed through the GRAS program or through the food additive petition process? One thing I would have to say is that the evidence of safety of a food additive is exactly the same evidence of safety for a GRAS substance. So they have exactly the same safety standard. However, for a GRAS substance, there must be general recognition of safety. So there must be general acceptance of the safety within scientists, and also the data that you provide must be generally available. So it should be a published data, peer-reviewed publications. Sometimes you can have information from textbooks and expert opinions from like EFSA, but that must be peer-reviewed. So that is really the main difference between a food additive petition pathway and a GRAS pathway. For food additive petition, it's an unpublished data that's submitted to the FDA. So the petitioner submits unpublished data to the FDA. The pivotal studies are unpublished. For GRAS substance, the pivotal studies must be published. Even though you can use unpublished data, but that's all supportive and corroborative, but that's not the pivotal data. Next slide, please. So common knowledge distinguishes GRAS use from food additive use. One thing is certain, if you do not have enough data, then you cannot market your ingredient as a food ingredient. If you have enough safety data, then you can market it. But then what path do you take? If the data is generally available and generally accepted by experts, then that is the GRAS path. If it is not generally available, then you go through the food additive. So again, common knowledge distinguishes GRAS use from food additive use. The data must be generally available and generally accepted within the scientific community. Next slide, please. So if you want to market a low or no calorie sweetener through the GRAS pathway, you can determine your GRAS status through one of two pathways. The first is the scientific procedures, where you have scientific data and information to support your GRAS determination. But again, this must be generally available and accepted scientific data, and it must be published. And like I mentioned before, the food additive data process, the quality and quantity of data that's required should be exactly the same as for a GRAS. There is also a second pathway for GRAS, which is the experience based on common use. So there should be substantial history of consumption of that food ingredient by a significant number of consumers. But I would say here that the majority of GRAS submissions that we see utilize the scientific procedures pathway. Next slide, please. So like I mentioned before, the safety standard for food additive and GRAS substances is reasonable certainty in the minds of competent scientists that the substance is not harmful under the intended conditions of use. So it's limited to the conditions of use. So if you're trying to market something next time and you change, let's say it was a sweetener before and then you decide to add a flavor use, that's a different use. So you have to submit new information to support that condition of use. So it's reasonable certainty of no harm. We cannot determine that something is absolutely safe, but we have to look at the reasonable certainty of no harm. So that's the safety standard for both food additive and GRAS substances. But like I mentioned, the notifier owns the safety conclusion for GRAS notifications. However, for FAPs, FDA owns the safety conclusion. Next slide, please. So these are the safety, the elements of a safety assessment of a food ingredient. You have to have the identity, the intended uses, how much of it will be consumed. So here we are looking at the estimated daily intake. Will the amount consumed be safe? So now we get into toxicology. We look at the nature of the ingredient, the composition of that ingredient, the tolerance, and also we look at that and compare it to an estimated exposure. Next slide, please. So I share this with you to show you that the toxicology studies that we see in a GRAS notification is very similar, the same thing that we see in a food additive. So this is a GRAS notice for an enzyme-modified stevia glycoside. The toxicology studies submitted by the notifier included acute, subchronic, chronic, reproductive, and gene tox studies, and also metabolic fate, which showed that the metabolism was similar between rats and humans. The only difference between this and the next slide for a food additive example is that these studies were all published. Next slide, please. So this is Advantame. You'd look at the list of studies, very similar toxicology studies. You have the subchronic, chronic studies, carcinogenicity. You also have gene tox and repro. So the same studies, the same toxicological studies, but the difference is in the case of GRAS, it's published. In the case of food additive petitions, it's unpublished data, and raw data is usually submitted as well. Next slide, please. So how much, which is the focus of this session, how much LNC is safe to eat? This depends on the totality of the evidence that we have. It's a weight of evidence approach, okay? So the nature of the ingredient is important, its composition. So if you're trying to market something that came from rice, and we consume rice all the time, and you have the composition, the nutritional profile are similar, and the metabolism of that ingredient is similar between rats and humans, for example, we will not have much concern. We also look at the toxicology data that's been provided. And from that toxicology data, we can determine what we call the no observed adverse effect level. And from that, we'll calculate a safe level of consumption, which is sometimes an acceptable daily intake. And from that, using an appropriate safety factor, we can calculate an acceptable daily intake from the NOEL. Okay, so when we get the ADI, we compare the daily exposure estimate to that safe consumption level. And that daily exposure estimate, which could be an estimated daily intake, and EDI, should be less than that safe consumption level, which could be an ADI. That gives us confidence that that LNCS is safe to consume. Next slide, please. So the safety conclusions that are made at the end would determine what kind of decision or response the FDA gives to the petitioner or the notifier. Next slide, please. So in the case of an FAP, if FDA approves that petition, meaning that there's reasonable certainty of no harm for that specific ingredient, there's a final rule that's drafted, and eventually there's a regulation that's published in the CFR and eventually codified in the CFR. But FDA can also deny the petition use. if there are safety concerns for that specific food additive. For GRAS, there are 3 kinds of replies or responses that the FDA can give. The first is no questions asked letter, where FDA has not questioned the notifier's GRAS conclusions under the intended conditions of use. Remember, the GRAS determination and FAP are limited to the intended conditions of use. The next response letter that the agency can give is what we call cease to evaluate, where the agency has, at the notifier's request, cease to evaluate. So there could be several reasons why this could happen. It could be a business decision. It could be that the notifier cannot really address FDA's questions. The third kind of letter that you can get through the GRAS pathway is what we call insufficient basis letter. That could happen if the notifier has not provided appropriate data and information to support their GRAS conclusion, or if the available data provided raises safety questions for that notified substance. Or also, remember, with the GRAS program, it has to be generally accepted. It has to be widely available, the data that you provide. So if that is not widely available, there's not general recognition, then the response will be an insufficient basis letter. Next slide, please. So this is just giving you an example of the total number of stevia glycosides and monk fruit extract that the FDA has received so far. For stevia glycosides, 67 have been received up to today, and of that, FDA has given out 65 no questions letter. And remember, the stevia glycosides based on GECFA specification should be greater than or equal to 95% purity of stevia glycosides. Cease to evaluate one, and that decision was a decision that came from the company because the FDA wanted them to resubmit a GRAS submission based on the amendments, and the company opted for cease to evaluate. For monk, we've received 4 GRAS notices, and all 4 have received no questions letter. So far, none of them have received insufficient basis letter. I would have to say that we have asked questions to the notifier during this process when we have concerns, and they address those questions. Next slide, please. So this is a table showing you some examples of these novel sweeteners. Again, the focus here is on stevia glycosides and monk fruit. The stevia glycosides that we have seen have come from the leaves of stevia, highly purified extracts. Some of them are enzyme modified, where, for example, you add an enzyme like glucosyl transferase and it adds many more glucose residues. Some of them have come from genetically engineered organisms, for example, Ryoa lipolytica yeast that has been made to produce stevia. When you look at the GECFA ADI for stevia glycosides, it's 4 milligram per kilogram body weight. When you look at the EDIs that were calculated for the stevia glycosides, they all fall below the GECFA ADI. And all of these cases, FDA had no question. So these are in the market. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, there's a difference between a GRAS substance and a food additive. So depending on how the LNCS will get into the market, you can choose to have the FAP or GRAS. But again, if you do not have sufficient data that's out there in the public, that's generally accepted by qualified scientists, you cannot go through the GRAS. You have to go through the FAP. However, the FAP process and the GRAS process have exactly the same safety standard, reasonable certainty of no harm. But FDA owns the safety conclusion for an FAP, and FDA approves the specific use of the food additive by rulemaking. The pivotal data that's used to support your food additive safety conclusion does not have to be publicly available. It's unpublished. For GRAS, the notifier owns the safety conclusion. The safety data supporting a GRAS conclusion must be publicly available. And remember that GRAS is specific to a specific use. Expanding or changing the use, if you decide to change the use from, let's say, a sweetener to a flavor, you will require new safety evidence depending on the ingredient and the proposed use. Like I mentioned, the safety standard is the same. One is not better than the other. The safety standard is exactly the same. How much is too much? If you're looking at an FAP, your EDI must be less than the acceptable daily intake. But again, it's much bigger than that. We look at the totality of the evidence. What is the weight of evidence? The toxicology data that you've provided and the ADI that was calculated. Is the EDI below that? you look at the nature of the ingredients. So for some ingredients, you do not have to even focus too much on the totality, on the toxicology data. The ingredient might be something that's innocuous. So the nature of the ingredient, its composition, is it something similar to what we're already consuming? The metabolism of that ingredient, is it metabolized equally in animals like in humans? Tolerance, when you consume that, like human tolerance studies, is there a lot of diarrhea? Okay. But one thing I would have to conclude with is that there's a lot of controversy about LNCS for some specific ones, but again, this is not a static process. As new safety data becomes available, it might warrant a re-evaluation of the LNCS. Next slide, please. So thank you, and I will be happy to answer any questions.
So thank you, Gwen, for your very clear and concise presentation. And just a reminder on questions, please post your questions for Gwen as well as our other speakers in the question box, and we'll have an opportunity for an extensive Q&A after all speakers present. Our next speaker is Danica Martin. Danica heads Intertech Health Sciences European office based in the UK, so it's later in the day for Danica. She has considerable experience in the authorization of novel foods, food additives, and enzymes in the European Union. Working alongside regulatory authorities, she has an active role in stewarding applications through the approval process. Danica is a recognized expert in dietary exposure assessment and has extensive experience in modeling food intake data to estimate human exposure to food chemicals, ingredients, and nutrients. Today, Danica will tell us about her work on exposure specific to LNCS. Take it away.
Thank you, Hope. So as Hope mentioned, I am going to be discussing low and no-calorie sweeteners within the context of occurrence and exposure. I have quite a number of slides, so I will jump straight in. The next slide is my disclosure slide. I work for Intertech Health Sciences, and today I'm going to be speaking about estimating dietary exposure to low and no-calorie sweeteners. I'll start off describing how and why we calculate intakes. I'm then going to give a bit of background in terms of modelling the exposure, what are the inputs and the outputs. I'll then go through the latest research and what does that tell us in terms of dietary exposure, and then I'll provide some overall summary and conclusions. So to begin, how and why do we calculate intakes? One of the basic fundamentals of toxicology is that the dose makes the poison. And for that reason, exposure assessment is a pivotal component of the risk assessment process, which in turn forms part of the risk analysis process. And Gwen did refer to that in her previous presentation, how the estimated daily intakes are always considered as part of the risk assessment process. And if we look very simply at the exposure assessment calculation, there are two main components when we're looking at exposure to a substance, such as a low and no-calorie sweetener. We need to look at the amount of a chemical in food, and then we need to look at the amount of food consumed and also the body weight, so that we can compare those intakes on to the toxicological threshold of concern, which is typically expressed on a body weight basis. And in terms of why are we interested in the intakes of low and no-calorie sweeteners, a point that has been mentioned previously and will be mentioned again over the course of this series is the recommendations for added sugar intakes. In the last number of years, we've had a number of recommendations from the World Health Organization and more recently for dietary guidelines for Americans to restrict or limit the intakes of free or added sugars. And we've also seen some changes in the labelling requirements in a number of countries. And the combination of these factors has led to a need for reformulation of products, which in turn can be associated with concern about low and no calorie sweeteners. But again, coming back to this point, we always need to consider what are the patterns and the overall intakes of these substances within the context of risk assessment. So when we discuss the methods for estimating exposure, we can consider the inputs and the outputs and how we can model these to best evaluate the overall dietary intakes to these substances. So looking back to this simple calculation, if we look first at the amount of the chemical in the food, we can consider both the concentration, so that's the level of use of the low or no calorie sweetener in the food. And from that, there's various different resources. We could look at regulatory limits or reported use levels or perhaps analytical data. And that helps us to understand what are the amounts that are present in foods. And then on the other side, we have presence. This is information as to whether the sweetener is in fact being used in the foods of interest. And that gives us a much clearer picture of how are these sweeteners being used. And this can be quite difficult information to obtain, particularly if we want to understand the most realistic estimates of exposure. Then we have the next components, the amount of food consumed in the body weight per day. And for this, we need to understand the overall dietary consumption of foods and beverages as part of the diet. And there's many different resources we can look at that for that information. We can look at theoretical intakes to get a very crude estimate of amounts of foods and beverages that can or may be consumed in a day. We can also look at summary statistics, or we can get much more refined individual-based data, such as the USN Haynes or other data sets like that. And these may be associated with body weight information for those individuals, or we can use default body weights for those individuals we're interested in. And then we look at the output. So when we get the results of our exposure assessment, we want to consider the entire population. So we need to look at, in addition to the average consumer, we want to consider high consumer or heavy consumers of these substances. So that may be the 90th or the 95th percentile, so that we're, when we're looking at those estimated daily intakes, we're confident that we're considering the full distribution of the population group. Another element to consider is brand loyalty. This is when an individual may be loyal to products that may or may not contain the chemical of interest. So having that understanding of brand loyalty is something that we should consider when we're looking at the exposure to a substance. And then there are population groups of concern. So one example would be toddlers. So toddlers are a group that tend to have very unique consumption patterns, and they will often have high levels of consumption of particular foods as they go through phases or fads, and they also have higher exposure when expressed on a body weight basis. Then we have other groups like diabetic individuals who need to adapt their food consumption patterns for medical reasons. And when we model our exposure, we want to compare those estimates to the ADI, or the relevant toxicological parameter. So for the next series of slides, I'm going to go through the latest research and what that tells us in terms of the patterns of intake for these substances for low and no calorie sweeteners. In 2018, a group of colleagues and I were tasked with reviewing the global intakes for 7 low and no calorie sweeteners. We did a review of the previous decade, so following on from research in 2008, identifying the methods that were being used in estimated daily intake models, the overall intake values from these studies, and also we wanted to see were there trends that we could see in terms of intakes over time. This slide shows the number of studies that were identified in each of the regions. There was a clear disparity in terms of the number of studies that were available. But if we look, Europe and Asia were the regions that had the highest number of studies. That was followed by Latin America, which had a total of 7 studies, and the other regions had a much lower number of studies. And there was a lot of information to digest as part of this, but some of the overall conclusions that the research indicated was that there were no concerns with respect to exceedance of sweetener ADIs among the general population globally. There were some exceedances in diabetics and children with special medical requirements. We also noted that there was no suggestion of a shift in exposure over time, with several studies indicating a reduction in the intake. And some data suggested there may have been an increase in the number of consumers of LNCS sweetened products. And overall, it was definitely noted that there was a huge variation in terms of the methodologies that were being used globally, and there were limited research available for many regions. So for the purpose of this talk, we conducted an updated literature search, and I'm going to present over the next series of slides 4 studies that were conducted for the Americas. The first of which was conducted by TRAN earlier this year. And on the left-hand side, I have some of the information with respect to the inputs or the approach and the exposure assessment. And then on the right, I have the key findings or takeaways from the research. So in this first study, TRAN examined the intakes of beverages using a tiered methodology ranging from the budget method to individual consumption data for US and UK individuals. They used reported use levels from industry and details on the presence to examine the exposure for 5 LNCS. They found that there was no exceedance of the ADI up to the 95th percentile for all 5 sweeteners in consumers in the most refined model. That was the brand loyal model, with the exception of saccharin at the 95th percentile in US toddlers and UK toddlers and children. And I should note that the US and the UK population groups were selected as they're typically considered higher than average or to have some of the highest intakes of beverages globally. The researchers also looked to the consumption of LNCS containing foods, beverages, and food beverage additions between diabetics and non-diabetics individuals, and they found there was no statistically differences between their consumption levels. And they also found that the refined budget method that they had used was a valid first tier for researchers moving forward. We can then look at research that was conducted in the Brazilian population. This group looked at both foods and beverages, including tabletop sweeteners, using national consumption data for individuals aged 10 years and over, and they looked at both brand loyal and non-brand loyal individuals. And they found that there was no exceedance of the ADI in 6 LNCS in both the brand loyal and the non-brand loyal scenario. And they found that the percent consumers of food and beverages was up to 3%, and the percent consumers of tabletop sweeteners was up to 26.5%. There were then 2 studies that were conducted for Chilean individuals. This was a study which was conducted for school children, and it was conducted after the enforcement of new food labelling legislation that regulated added sugar content in processed foods. So the researchers wanted to understand whether there was a change in the intakes of LNCS following that legislative change. And they looked at both food and beverages for 6 LNCS, and they used a food frequency questionnaire over the previous month. They found that there was no exceedance for the ADI for any of the sweeteners, and they found the highest intake frequency was for sucralose, and the lowest frequency of consumption was for saccharin and cyclamate, and they identified the primary sources were dairy products and beverages. And finally, then there was another study conducted among Chilean individuals, this time among students from 4 universities. This study looked only at stevia, and they found that stevia consumption did not exceed the ADI in consumers only, with up to 83.7% of the ADI. They looked at the intakes by demographic, and they found the highest intakes of stevia were amongst females and individuals with high or medium-high socioeconomic status. So that just gives an overview of the most recent research on this topic with respect to the usage or the intake specifically of low and no calorie sweeteners. So to conclude, understanding intakes by the population is critical for making evidence-based decisions and providing risk managers with the information that they need. Evidence in the literature does not suggest concern with respect to low and no calorie sweeteners by the general population up to the 95th percentile. There have been exceedances in particular groups such as young children, diabetics, and individuals with special nutritional requirements. And it is always important to consider brand loyalty, particularly for products like soft drinks or dairy products where individuals may be loyal to a particular brand in that category. Monitoring is very important to look at intakes, the impact on intakes after changes to legislation or guidelines, similar to the MARTINEZ study. And it also is useful for looking at trends over time. There are many different methods which can be used, and the method that is chosen depends on the resources available. It's typically recommended to take a tiered approach, starting with broader or cruder methods that don't require too many resources, and then refining these down as needed. And it is always important to look at an uncertainty analysis to consider what are the sources of over or underestimation so that the reviewer can consider these in context. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Danica, for that very clear and concise presentation as well. So let's move on to our final speaker, who will bring the perspective of a practicing pediatrician, Dr. Bob Murray. Bob Murray has spent over 20 years in the field of pediatric gastroenterology and nutrition at The Ohio State University School of Medicine. I always giggle when I say The Ohio State. For 5 years, he served as the director of the Center for Healthy Weight and Nutrition, offering medical and surgical treatments for child and adolescent obesity. Bob also was the pediatric medical director for Abbott Nutrition from 2003 to 2006. And for over a decade, he was an executive committee member of the American Academy of Pediatrics Council on School Health. So we'll turn the platform over to you, Bob.
Thank you, Hope, and thank you everyone for joining us. I'm learning a lot today, which is always my indication of a good session. I want to talk a little bit about pediatricians and parents and their perception of low-calorie and no-calorie sweeteners. And I simply use LCS here, but it includes both, obviously. These are my disclosures. Mainly, I'm involved with education and teaching. There are some consensus statements that we overconsume added sugars, and I think everyone can agree that that's probably the case, given the fact that we are taking in a lot of energy that does not have nutritional value, and that is a concern among many children and adults. There is still controversy about whether sugars are the problem or energy is the problem. And so if you look at studies that are extremely well controlled for activity level and energy, and only sugars are varied, we really don't see sugars as being toxic, but it should be understood there is a general feeling among the medical community and now among parents that sugars themselves are toxic and that they should be decreased for that reason. As you know, and Danica just talked about it, the recommendations are for less than 10% of total energy, mainly to make way for nutrient-rich foods to give us our best ability to meet the dietary guidelines. And some of the recommendations have indicated 5% added sugars, which is almost an impossibility given the fact that sugars have many different roles in the food supply and are used in production of many, many different products. If you look at the table, low-calorie sweeteners by type, and monk fruit is not on here, but the others are, and you look at how they were introduced, we have a long history going back to even before the 1960s, where we've had these sweeteners in the food supply, and we have not seen population-wide problems from these sweeteners. The thing that's of interest to me is that because we report sweetness of the low-calorie sweeteners versus sucrose, the medical community and often the lay people are looking at that sweetness as if it's an absolute value within the product. So physicians will say, well, of course, low-calorie sweeteners are a problem. They're 200 times sweeter than sucrose. It makes it feasible that they are therefore addicting and misreading, the cues of the body in terms of metabolism. And what they don't appreciate is that the sweetness has been made equivalent to sucrose, but that the amount that they're being exposed to is much less. An interesting thing to me, but I've come across this frequently among physicians, that the sweetness intensity is a problem for them when thinking about LCS. There are several other issues here with research confounders that have made the research difficult for physicians to think about and sift through. One is that the literature tends to lump low-calorie sweeteners together as a population exposure. And many times doctors think about it in those terms, but in reality, all of these different low-calorie sweeteners have different metabolic fates, and that really changes the equation. The second thing is that we're not exposed to a single LCS. We're exposed to multiple different ones, and it's changing over time as products are developed and brought out into the market. In addition to that, we're still exposed to added sugars, which means that you have exposure to LCS in the context of a very complex food universe, and research is trying to isolate this single LCS and its potential effects. Almost impossible to do that outside of a research environment, a controlled research environment. We know that the exposure to LCS is most commonly beverages, as Danica just mentioned, and beverage consumption is associated with other lifestyle habits. More screen time, more sodium exposure, other types of processed foods tend to ride together with beverages. So it becomes an issue when you look at research, particularly in cohort studies where they're looking longitudinally, such as the Nurses' Health Study. It becomes a problem teasing out the individual food versus the other foods. One of the biggest confounders in research is the fact that overweight people inordinately tend to seek out low-calorie sweeteners as a means of cutting calories, and therefore you get what's called reverse causality, that it looks like the sweetener is causing problems with obesity, when in reality it's obesity that's causing the increase in low-calorie sweetener use. There's a paucity of studies on children and adolescents, and that really drives physicians nuts. So many different research confounders that make it hard for physicians, particularly pediatricians who are extremely conservative, to say, I think low-calorie sweeteners are a good thing and should be used more often to tackle our added sugar problem. This is a very interesting time. If you look at sugar intake, added sugar intake, it peaked in 1999. And since that time, we as a population have been dropping added sugar intake pretty precipitously. Levels now, when you look at 2016, 17, 18, 19, you see levels that are approaching added sugar intake consumption levels that we saw back in the 70s. So the message has gotten across to back away from added sugars. It was coupled with the fact that we were very fat phobic in the 90s, and so sugars became a means of improving a low-fat product and making it saleable. But things are changing, and trends are changing among both parents and adults, and the thinking is changing among physicians. But I'm impressed with something. Most physicians I speak with are not aware of the fact that added sugars have been falling so precipitously in the last 20 years. Even those who are experts in nutrition have not necessarily kept up with that trend. And it's something that we need to talk about because it's a positive for one thing, but two, I think low-calorie sweeteners have played a role in that. It's easier to study sugar-sweetened beverages versus low-calorie sugar-sweetened beverages. And so the preponderance of literature focuses on that one area almost as a proxy for consumption. But what you see when you look at children recently is a dramatic change in their intake of liquids, their beverages. The classic children's drinks have been described as being in terminal decline. We are seeing much more plant-based beverages, water, teas, coffees, and other things that may or may not be sweetened, replacing sugar-sweetened beverages and fruit drinks. And you can see here, water has really become a fad. Partly it's because schools have eliminated a lot of sugar-sweetened beverages and replaced that with water, and also because among higher socioeconomic children and teens, water has become an accepted thing to carry around and drink. Dramatic changes. One sad aside is that despite all this shift and this change away from sugar-sweetened beverages, milk intake did not go up, and we're still running short on getting diet quality improved by filling our dairy food group. Statements can be made, though, I think, and we've all seen them coming from the CDC, the WHO, many different expert groups, the Heart Association, the Diabetes Association, that indicate that the preponderance of literature allows us to say that these are extremely well-studied compounds in low-calorie sweeteners, that they are safe for adults, children, and diabetics and pregnant women. If there's anybody more conservative than a pediatrician, it's an obstetrician. And yet they have accepted the fact that in order to preserve sweetness and lower the intake of added sugars to manage weight, to manage glycemia, that LCS is a good and safe alternative. We can say definitively from the National Cancer Institute that LCS does not cause cancer, any of them. They're not associated with weight gain or risk factors for chronic disease. You still see a hodgepodge of the literature, but when you look at good studies, systemic reviews, meta-analyses, well-controlled studies, they simply don't show that there's an association between consumption of LCS and weight gain or risk of chronic disease. And then finally, they're associated with a low risk of dental caries. So we are seeing an opportunity here for us to use LCS. And these statements really illustrate the preponderance of the literature, of the good solid literature, and the best evaluation by experts around these topic areas. But you don't always see that translated even among medical communities. The other thing that we've talked about, Joanne spoke eloquently about how safety is determined. But the ADI to me has always been a very powerful message that they take a substance and they want to know, is this safe? If you stay at the ADI or below, you can consume that every day for the rest of your life. It is the highest exposure that causes any toxicologic effect, plus then divided by that uncertainty factor, which makes it almost a factor of 100 times less likely to cause any toxicologic event. And so if you can get a good estimation, as Danica pointed out, for exposure, what we're seeing is the best estimates we have is we're nowhere near the ADI for most LCS. And it would be extremely unlikely, even if you cross the ADI, that you would get anywhere near toxicologic levels or that you would sustain it over time. This message is simply not sinking in among medical professionals who do counseling of parents every day. And this is something I think that is a tremendous opportunity for all of us. When I looked at the 2019 use of non-nutritive sweeteners policy statement from the American Academy of Pediatrics, they started out the statement saying directly, we're not going to make a recommendation here. But what they did is they went on and did a review of the literature. Unfortunately, they didn't look at the preponderance of best studies. They kind of looked at everything, observational studies and other things. And what ended up was a lot of concerns still lingering in this statement, despite the fact that they've got agencies such as National Cancer Institute and the Diabetes Association telling them that they don't have concerns. The main concerns were safety over the lifetime of consumption of a child. Two, that there might be a reinforcement of preferences for sweet. And again, this is where that sweetness factor versus sucrose comes in. Their interpretation is these things are hyper sweet and they're driving that reinforcement. The feeling that the ADI may be breached at the highest levels of intake, particularly among toddlers. But as I said, the ADI is just a threshold level. It would have to be sustained at an even higher level for life to give us a real health risk. They still believe that this literature is indicating that low-calorie sweeteners are associated with obesity and risk for chronic disease, despite good studies that have said no. And they say plausible mechanisms exist, and these are the three that are cited. Interfere with basic gut regulatory processes that prevent us from overeating, feedback processes, because we're taking in sweet, but we're not taking in energy, and therefore we're getting misreadings from the LCS. Secondly, that it mimics dopaminergic food pathways that are reinforcing for behavior. Sweetness seeking is built into our DNA, and we seek out things that are sweet. They have a lot of concern that this leads to pathways in the brain that could cause addiction to food. The word addiction is loaded. Evidence for addiction is not really there. It's a very controversial word and idea. It's no question sweet foods taste good and we get the pleasure centers turned on. And then the third and most recent is disrupt the gut microbiota, altering glucose and metabolic signaling in the body. As you know, bacterial metabolic products serve many functions, but they do get into the bloodstream. They do stimulate the nervous system in the gut, and those signals do reach the brain and tend to indicate signals as to whether things are homeostatic or whether there are potential disruptions. There are some papers indicating that the gut microbiota are changed, not necessarily to a pathologic thing, but they are changed from the normal in the presence of LCS. It's a little hard to believe because the amount of LCS is so small and the flora is so powerful at preventing shifts, but the literature is indicating there may be some shift there. And then parental confusion comes out of this. If you could imagine confusion among pediatricians and physicians, there's going to be a lot of confusion among parents and adults on the websites. Interestingly enough, they are of two minds. One is they hear these concerns and they're concerned themselves for their children. But there's also an acceptance that goes back to the mid-60s that light or low-calorie products are healthy. So we have two ways in the public of thinking about this. As you know, the concerns get a lot of sensational press. They bounce around on social media. I'll give you an example. High fructose corn syrup, which was the whole market for which was completely destroyed by speculation that began in the year 2000. By 2010, we had good evidence that high fructose corn syrup acted like any other sugar. It was not something that was toxic or poisonous or leading to the destruction of humanity, but it did destroy the high fructose corn syrup market. And in addition, that still bounces around on the internet as if it is a problem. The science behind that has not trickled down onto social media platforms. We are seeing beverages in home, in school, and then away from home. A lot of the consumption takes place away from school, as I mentioned, because they have policies, and parents lose control as the adolescent becomes an adolescent. The general perception is if there's fewer calories and less added sugar, I have a healthy diet. In the US, that is not always the case, but it would be an advantage if we could have fewer empty calories taken in. That is a target everybody and parents all agree is good. We're getting little guidance from pediatricians. Even the experts in nutrition in the American Academy have not stepped out to support LCS. And I think that is a problem trying to tackle all these other issues of diet quality and low added sugar intake if the other tool that we can use is taken away. So I just would summarize by saying there's a few things I think that we could use. One, we could get better education on the safety of LCS, how it's been evaluated, and the ADI, how that ADI gives us an enormous buffer of safety against toxicologic adverse events. Secondly, we really have to get a consensus among experts that we publish well, saying that low-calorie sweeteners are, one, not harmful, and two, may be effective, not alone in controlling weight, but as part of a lifestyle change, they can be effective. Most expert groups, Heart Association, Diabetes Association, have said that statement. These can be helpful. Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics has stood out for a long time as saying that this can be part of a total diet. And then I think some kind of a simple front of pack icon that gives consumers the sense that sucrose and the low calorie sweeteners are equally sweet, not hyper sweet on the part of LCS, but that the amount of LCS that you need is very small compared to what it takes for flavoring with sucrose. Good example, soft drinks with 10 teaspoons of sugar, much, much, much less when you're using something like stevia or other sweeteners there. So I think we have a conundrum in that we have a good literature base, a tremendous literature base around all the different low-calorie sweeteners. We simply have not penetrated the public to give them a sense of comfort. And in particular, we're having a very difficult time convincing pediatricians who, as I said, are very conservative about accepting anything new. So thank you, and back to you, Hope.
So thank you, Bob. That was wonderful and music to my ears as someone who's spent a lot of time trying to communicate about low and no calorie sweeteners. So if all of our panelists could rejoin and turn your webcams and your voice back on, we'll open this up for some dialogue. And we'll kick off our discussion with a few questions for each speaker. And we encourage our speakers to ask each other questions. And we have some great questions already from our audience members. So since Juan has had the most time to rest up from speaking, let me start with this question. Once an LNCS is approved as a food additive, or the FDA has had no questions regarding the notifier's conclusion that the ingredient is GRAS, is this a decision that can ever or never be reversed?
Thank you, Hope, for that question. As new data becomes available, a decision can be made to change the status. So I'll give you an example. We have what we call the Delaney clause. And that clause prohibits the addition, FDA from approving any food additive that causes cancer in man or animals when it's done through experiment, appropriate methods. So if, for example, the National Toxicology Program, for example, does some 2-year cancer bioassay and finds out that any of those sweeteners, LNCS, cause cancer, that will be revisited. The safety evaluation will be redone, and that will not be allowed in the food supply. So something could be GRAS today for a specific use, but as new data becomes available, it might no longer be GRAS. I'll give you an example of something that happened a couple of years ago. It's not a sweetener, but it's a flavor. So we have those 7 flavors that were in the US supply for quite a number of years, since the 60s. But a new study came out for some of these flavors that said they do cause cancer. And because of that, when we evaluated the studies, we agreed with the studies, even though they were not public health risk concern at the time, because when you looked at the exposure levels compared to the ADR, it was really, really low. But because those studies had been done in animals and they were shown to cause cancer in animals, the FDA had no choice but to ban those substances. So it is not a static process. It is a dynamic process. Depending on the new data that comes out, will require re-evaluation, and the status might change.
Great. And Juan, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the Delaney clause dates back to 1960s.
Yes.
Very much impacted saccharin.
Yes, very much so.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you.
I'm going to stay on Juan for a moment with a question from the audience. Does the FDA expect to reopen their evaluations of LNCS in light of the EFSA or IR reviews of low and no calorie sweeteners?
So again, we can rely on some of those things, but we have our own evaluation that we have to do. So ARC might come out with changes with the LNCS, EFSA might have their own, but then we have to do our own independent evaluation. Taking into consideration the new data, we'll have to review it. So we cannot rely completely on what ARC says or EFSA, but we can do our own independent evaluation. And if we agree with what they're saying, then we can make changes. So it is, again, like I said, it is not a static process, it's dynamic, and we have to do our own independent evaluation. We don't rely on what others say.
Excellent. Okay, Danica, just a terminology question as someone based in the US. Is the term free sugars analogous to the term we use, added sugars? If not, what are the differences?
So the WHO in their definition includes fruit juices, whereas the added sugar definition doesn't. So that is definitely a difference between it. And when you're looking at intakes, you do need to take that into account. I believe in the FDA or one of the US groups has clearly differentiated from the WHO definition in terms of excluding the naturally occurring sugars in fruit juice.
Okay, Schwen, do you want to comment at all on that?
No, I don't have any comment to make on that definition. Thank you.
Okay, terrific. Okay, question for Bob here. Social media and websites that publish health and nutrition advice are a big source of quote unquote information or perhaps more accurately stated misinformation about LNCS. What are some steps that food and beverage manufacturers as well as healthcare providers can take to deal with this misinformation? And is education a sufficient tool?
Sir, good questions. I think the first thing is what I always try to do in practice is steer my patients and their parents to websites that have real information that evaluates the evidence and gives a real sense of the science. And that is a big problem in social media, is that when you go on and click on a keyword, you end up with a lot of garbage before you get down to the good, really good site. So I steer them to the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, and generally to the AAP and other places where I think they can find the best nutrition evidence, and we'll get a good reflection of that. Is education enough? Apparently not. One of the things that we've learned, if anything, in the last 20 years is that behavior change is not about education. You can know something and not change the way you behave. And in nutrition, that is particularly true. And in fact, I have to say, one of the things that has me concerned about the medical community attacking both added sugars and low-calorie sweeteners at the same time is that what you're essentially asking the consumer to do is give up the hedonics of sweetness, and they're not going to do that. So you almost have to give them a risk to benefit. Where would you get the most benefit? And to me, LCS makes total sense in that regard. But not an easy thing. This happens all the time in medicine, where we want both Tweedledum and Tweedledee. We can't have both. You've got to come up with a rational, weighted judgment here.
Great. Okay, I'm going to throw the next question out. My instinct is it's for Danica, but it could be for Schwen as well. Can data to support history of consumer consumption include usage from other cultures and countries besides North America?
So that's looking at what the consumption is in other regions, and then trying to determine whether they would be suitable kind of representative patterns. It depends on the specific foods. We can often see very distinct patterns in particular foods. I know I work with my Canadian counterparts a lot, and when I'm looking at the consumption databases, some foods are completely different. Cookies and biscuits is one example. And that can lead to different patterns. So it can be difficult to have that read across, and particularly with dietary intake assessments, we do always want to have the highest estimates or the most conservative estimates to make sure that we're being protective of those consumers. So there may be some room for it, but it would need to be justified to be able to have that read across. I don't know, Joanne, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I wanted to add, when I think about the GRAS program, for example, that has that component where you can do your GRAS determination through the common use in food. That's a very difficult hurdle, okay? Because when you're looking at common use in food, some people have tried to use, like you mentioned in the question, use from another country and says it's been used, let's say in China for 1,000 years, right? To use that as a reason. But then are you using the same, let's say it's an ingredient that comes from a plant. Are you using the same, let's say if it came from the leaves, is that the same kind of leaf? Is the composition the same? Is it processed in the same way? So there are so many factors that will come in. So we cannot just say because it's been used, for example, in Africa for 1,000 years, you can use that as history of use. Is it exactly the same thing? Is it exactly the same part of the plant that's being used? Is the composition identical? Is the manufacturing identical? So those are all the considerations that have to be given. The fact that it's been used in another country for so many years does not necessarily mean that it's okay, because you're not sure what parts of the plant was used. You're not sure about the composition. The soil composition there might be different, and that might affect, let's say, the concentration of heavy metals, for example. So there are so many factors that will come into play. I don't know if that helps.
Great. Okay, Bob, I'm going to come back to you, and I'm going to beg to differ a little bit with you. You talked a few times about the statements from the American Heart Association and statements from American Diabetes Association. And if anything, I think that they've gotten weaker over time. And I feel like the current AHA and recommendation, and the one on beverages is what I'm talking about, basically says drink water. And then the ADA, the last revision in 2019, at least the nutrition therapy consensus report, and then that's what's used in their annual standards of care, sort of uses that same statement. And while they say we support FDA's approval, they've really been watered down. So I don't think that we can necessarily look to those statements as, sort of gung-ho supportive of low and no calorie sweeteners. So
No, it's certainly not an enthusiastic endorsement by any means. In fact, they're hedging their bets on this. A lot of it has to do with who's sitting on those committees and perspectives shift. They have made the statement before that you can use these for weight control and for glycemic management. And certainly diabetics use these all the time to maintain sweetness and not have that craving for sweet, but at the same time maintain good glycemic control. But to tell the public to drink water is essentially to say, give up sweetness out of your, and they're just not going to do it. I remember this study that was done. A guy went out into Aboriginal groups who had lived apart from modern society, and they said, are there any things about your diet that you would change? And the two things that they wanted the most were honey and meat. So it's like, come to the US, we're good. But I think it is one of those things where the medical community is trying to be purist, but they're not responding to the preponderance of evidence that we have to date. Yes, we're not going to have, probably never going to have lifetime data on children's exposure to LCS and be able to say definitively one way or another if it has a lifetime, a potential lifetime adverse event. We just aren't going to ever be able to do that study. So we end up in this conundrum. But I agree with you, they have been weakening, and it's because of this echo chamber of chatter. One thing I'll say to Joanne, this is fascinating listening to your presentation. When I looked at the 2019 policy statement in the AAP, they basically almost poo-pooed GRAS evaluation for stevia and monk fruit because, for a number of reasons, they felt it was weaker, or they talked as if it was weaker, but they also talked as if it opened up the potential for bias on the expert review, which I thought was kind of interesting, almost as if the experts are coming from the business end and will bias the decision as to whether GRAS exists. So that's the reason, Hope, I think you're seeing a lot of this waffling, is they simply have not thought about all these different things, and they're not going with the preponderance of risk to benefit. They're going for purity.
So Joanne, I'll kick it back to you.
Yeah, so I understand. I've been at workshops where people think the GRAS program is a loophole, it's weaker, but that's not true. It's actually, sometimes I even think it's even a bigger hurdle, because it has to be published in peer-reviewed journals. It has to be generally available and generally accepted in the scientific community. So in all honesty, it's a bigger hurdle to even achieve. Because when you look at the food additive petition process, you have all these volumes of data that come in, but they're not published. It's coming from the sponsor. So this, again, the safety standard between a GRAS ingredient and a food additive is exactly the same. Reasonable certainty of no harm, exactly the same. The quality and quantity of data, exactly the same. We see the same kinds of reproductive studies, chronic studies, two-generational studies across. The only difference is that with the GRAS program for stevia glycosides and monk fruit, when you look at the response letters and what was submitted, you have all of that toxicology data submitted. The only difference is that it's published when you're looking at stevia glycosides and monk fruit. For food additives like Advantame or aspartame, they were not published data. The pivotal studies are not published. So I just wish the community, the scientific community, will get a better understanding of it. The safety standard is exactly the same. The only difference is one has to be generally accepted, one has to be generally or widely available in the scientific literature, which to me is even a bigger hurdle. Yeah. I hope that clarifies it.
Great. Joanne, there have been a few questions on allulose, and the first was regarding FDA review. Does allulose fall under GRAS or FAP or something different?
When I look at the database that I see, the allulose I've seen fall under GRAS. For those that has been completed, it falls under GRAS. But I know for sure that this committee, the low and no calorie sweetener committee here, doesn't really look at those polyols, so which is why I didn't include any of them on my slides. But for the ones I've seen like trehalose and allulose, most of them come in as GRAS that I have seen completed.
Okay, and then there was another question, and I think this is best for you, Joanne, is do you have an opinion on the use of sugars that metabolize differently than traditional sugars? And the example given is allulose.
I have to see the data to make that conclusion. I cannot really say for sure without seeing the data if they're metabolized exactly the same way. But when we look at, for example, the low and no calorie sweeteners, we look at the way it's been metabolized, the data that comes to us, the metabolic fit, for example, of, I'll give stevia glycosides, we have to see if it's metabolized exactly the same way in rats and humans. So that's what we have to look at. But in terms of sugar and the sweeteners, I cannot really say without seeing the data in front of me. I can't comment on that.
Okay. Okay. Danica, as you know, there are some different ADIs across the globe, which tend to be used in the assessments that you shared.
So there are some for some specific ADIs. If we take the example of the review in 2018, we did use primarily the JECFA ADI unless they were EU specific studies. And obviously it will be region specific. If it's an ADI, if we're looking at a population group in a region, we'll use the relevant ADI. So it's generally in a case by case, but JECFA is obviously very well referenced.
Could I ask Danica, is that a change in the uncertainty factor, or are there differences in the estimated intake? What's driving a different ADI in one place versus another?
That will be a choice by the researchers in terms of what they consider to be the most relevant. If we take, I know for 2 of the sweeteners, there was a lower ADI by EFSA, set by EFSA, and when they were using EU-specific data, they said it makes sense to use an EFSA assessment, but it's not related to the estimated intakes. This was the that would be set before they conduct the analysis. So it's generally region specific and what they consider most relevant for the population.
Okay.
Can I just comment on that too? I know I've seen different ADIs. FDA has a different ADI from JECFA. Yeah, sometimes it depends on the data that's available to the agency at the time, what's reviewed. That could drive what the ADI, because EFSA or JECFA might have some data that's not available to the FDA and vice versa. So again, it depends on the data that's available and what the agency considers as the most sensitive endpoint at the time. So all of that will also determine why we have differences sometimes in some of the ADIs.
Great. I'm glad you chimed in on that one, Gwen. Bob, I'm going to come to you, and I know you touched on this, and it is sort of a hot topic these days. The question reads, some recent literature indicates that some food ingredients, including some LNCS, may lead to gut microbiome dysbiosis and resulting inflammation. Should impact on gut microbiome be part of an ingredient safety assessment?
It certainly wouldn't be my my call to say whether it should or shouldn't, but I think it's becoming an issue that everyone has to look at, whether you're in pharma or you're in nutrition. We're seeing much more sharply how well the signaling from bacterial metabolic products control the immune system in the lamina propria, inflammation locally, but also systemically signal the brain, and therefore results in the brain responding with glucocorticoid secretion and other things to try and control inflammation. So it makes a difference if the bacterial flora is not stable or becomes, or if pathogens get a foothold. But I want to say on the other side of that, we're still kind of in our infancy of understanding the bacterial flora. The fact that it changes doesn't necessarily mean that it's a negative. It's incredibly complex. There are trillions of bacteria per gram in the fecal matter, and so you really have to look at it from a number of different perspectives over time to see whether or not the change is positive, negative, or neutral. I will say that the typical bacterial flora, the adult bacterial flora with preponderance of bifidobacter, is extremely difficult to change in a long-term sense. You can impact it, but it tends to come right back to stability, which is why it's so powerful for health. Yeah, it's a very interesting question, but it's good. We're all going to have to reckon with the bacteria microbiome as part of our thinking in terms of science.
Right, and I don't think the literature overall to date concludes that LNCS interfere with the gut microbiome.
No, very controversial and still early. Yeah.
Gwen, it seems that over the last decade or so, LNCS have coming to market have fallen under the GRAS notification process. Do you think going forward we'll see fewer LNCS that go through a food additive versus GRAS, or is this just happenstance?
Yeah, you're absolutely right that you're seeing more of them coming in through the GRAS program. But again, the notifier has to determine if their data is available, right, publicly available. So we cannot make that call. It is the call of the notifier. So if they find out that there's a lot of literature out there and it's widely accepted within the population, then they can come in as GRAS. And I think that's why we are saying that. But if they don't have that data that's publicly available, then they have to go through the FAP pathway. And again, the nature of the ingredient really matters. If you have something that's highly synthetic, then likelihood is it's going to go through the FAP pathway. But if you have something that's been extracted from a fruit, for example, so again, the nature of the ingredient really matters. So that will really determine also the path that will be taken. And if there's so much information out there, there's a general consensus, among scientists that this information is out there, it's accepted, then most likely the GRAS route will be taken. So again, it depends on the type of ingredient. You're absolutely right that we are seeing more of them coming through the GRAS program. That's correct. But again, the sponsor would have to determine, based on the nature of the ingredient and the amount of data and safety information that's out there, which path to take.
Excellent. I'm going to go to Danica. You mentioned a couple times brand loyalty. Maybe explain that term a little bit more and why it's so important when you're assessing LNCS.
Yeah, it is something that certainly we've seen more of in recent studies. And the idea is for particular foods, and soft drinks is one example, people do tend to be loyal to a specific brand. They will always pick that brand if they're going to consume a soft drink. And that means if we're looking at exposure, we need to consider those as potentially higher than average consumers when we're incorporating the chemical concentration data. Now, it can go both ways. They may, if we're looking at a particular sweetener, stevia, it may not be used in those particular products that are highly consumed. But it is something that we need to consider when we're looking at the full distribution of intake. So yeah, we've started to see it's particularly for products. If we're looking at a substance that is used in say, a very standard product that people wouldn't tend to be very brand loyal to, it's not such a consideration. But when we look at soft drinks and the likes, that is something that we do want to consider when we're looking at exposure.
Excellent. So I am going to bring our session to a close, and I want to offer a very big thank you to each of the panel members for your presentation and for your great answers to questions. So thank you. Have a great rest of your meeting.